With Donald Trump now in the White House, defense spending has been an even bigger topic of discussion among NATO allies. Notably, the American president has been on record saying that he would not come to the assistance of any ally that, in his words, didn't pay their bills.
No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want. You got to pay. You got to pay your bills.
Of course, that's not how NATO defense spending works, and the president is more likely referring to countries that fail to reach the minimum 2% of GDP target that has been agreed upon by members of the alliance. More recent comments by the US Secretary of Defense further hints that the US may not be the reliable partner that it once was.
As the United States prioritizes its attention to these threats, European allies must lead from the front. Together, we can establish a division of labor that maximizes our comparative advantages in Europe and Pacific, respectively.
This has led many European nations to rethink their defense spending and defense strategies. But with the Baltics being right beside Russia and Belarus, it's been easy to justify spending much more than 2% of GDP on defense. And so, just how much are Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia allocating to national security in 2025? And what exactly is the money being spent on? We take a look at the numbers for today's video. Starting with Lithuania, the 2025 state budget makes it possible to allocate 4% of GDP to defense. As reported by LRT, the draft budget initially allocated about 2.5 billion euros for defense, or just over 3% of GDP. However, the new government increased the 2025 borrowing limit by roughly 800 million euros. And so, if the government and the Ministry of Defense deem it necessary, it can borrow part of or all of this amount. Upcoming major expenditures, among other things, includes the likely acquisition of Swedish CV-90 tracked infantry fighting vehicles, as well as the growth of the armed forces to form a division. The establishment and sustainment of the incoming German brigade will also come at a cost. In addition to government spending on its own defense, Lithuania will stay committed to spending 0.25% of GDP on security and defense assistance to Ukraine. Next up is Latvia. The country's approved 2025 state budget allocates roughly 1.56 billion euros for defense, about 3.45% of the gross domestic product. Minister of Defense Andris Spruds commented on the budget, saying, "Strengthening our defense capabilities by acquiring new weapons and replenishing our stockpiles is the only way to deter Russia's aggression against Latvia in the long term. That is why this is an armaments budget with 76% dedicated to the development and strengthening of the national armed forces." Spruds adds that, like Lithuania, 0.25% of Latvia's gross domestic product will be used over the next 3 years to provide military support to Ukraine in its fight against the invaders. A significant part of the budget will be allocated to cooperation with Latvian industry to strengthen the capabilities of the national armed forces. As you can see with the graphic here, the bulk of Latvia's 2025 defense budget, 42%, will be used to develop military capabilities. About 26% of the budget will cover personnel costs, another 26% will go to maintenance costs, 6% will be used to develop military infrastructure. The main projects for the development of the National Armed Forces combat capabilities are the implementation of a layered air defense system, the acquisition of coastal defense missiles, and the procurement of infantry fighting vehicles, artillery, ammunition, and equipment. Almost 100 million euros will be allocated for infrastructure development. The largest construction project for the National Armed Forces is the Salonia military training area, the first phase of which will be completed in 2025. This will be the largest military training area in the Baltic and Nordic region, and it's needed in order to provide increasingly large-scale military exercises of the National Armed Forces and the NATO multinational brigade deployed in Latvia. And finally, we've reached Estonia. The government's total approved 2025 state budget sees 18.2 billion euros in expenditure. From this, Estonia will allocate 5.6 billion euros over the next 4 years for military defense. An additional 1.6 billion euros was added in the national budget strategy for the purchase of ammunition for long-range weapon systems until 2031. Defense spending will increase in the coming years and will therefore be well above 3% of GDP, reaching at least 3.3% each year and 3.6% in 2027. As it stands, Estonia highlights that it is second in NATO in terms of defense spending, behind Poland and ahead of the US. According to the website Breaking Defense, ammunition will be the main spending priority for Estonia's Ministry of Defense. Like the other two Baltic countries, Estonia will continue to assist Ukraine in strengthening its self-defense capacity in the amount of 0.25% of the GDP. For Estonia, this exceeds €100 million annually. The state will do this with the help of products from the Estonian defense industry as much as possible. Okay, so let's recap and summarize the figures for 2025. Lithuania will spend between 2.5 to 3.3 billion euros on defense, which is between 3 and 4% of GDP. The actual figure will depend on if it decides to borrow additional funds. Latvia will spend 1.56 billion euros for defense, about 3.45% of the gross domestic product. Estonia's figure was a bit harder to determine, as sources only seem to report 5.6 billion euros over 4 years. If averaged out, this would be 1.4 billion per year, but we know that spending increases in 2027, and so spending each year is different. Nonetheless, as a percentage of GDP, it's 3.3% for the most northern Baltic nation. We should say that all three nations want to further increase their defense spending to as high as 5% of GDP in the coming years. Speaking to media, Lithuania's president stated in January 2025, "We have agreed that in the period 2026 to 2030, we will allocate between 5 and 6% of gross domestic product to defense annually." Latvia's president has been on the record saying that Latvia will have to increase its defense spending to approximately 4% of GDP in the coming years. And then Estonia's prime minister was quoted as saying, "The new American president, Donald Trump, has made it quite clear that he expects NATO defense spending to rise to 5%. People ask what I think. I support a faster increase in defense capabilities. We know our adversary. Just as Poland, Latvia and Lithuania must aim for 5% in defense spending, so must we." Of course, while the percentage of GDP may be high, the GDP of these countries is tiny compared to many other NATO allies. Nonetheless, it is a sacrifice for these small countries and their smaller economies. What are your thoughts on defense spending across the Baltics? Let us know what you think by leaving a comment.